What if the greatest cover-up in biblical history wasn't a missing book, but a bloodline? A race of beings so massive, so terrifying, that seasoned warriors trembled and prophets stood stunned, not once, but again, after the flood that was supposed to wipe them out. The Bible didn't hide them, it mentioned them by name. 5 races, 5 front lines, and yet for centuries we've skipped over their stories. Why? Because their presence shatters everything we thought we understood about God's judgment, man's rebellion, and the invisible war that still rages around us today. These weren't just tall men. These were strategically placed giants, living barricades standing between God's people and their destiny. If you've been searching for the untold truths of Scripture, the parts no one talks about, you're in the right place. Welcome to Sacred Wisdom, where we uncover what others avoid. Subscribe now and join us on this journey through the forgotten corners of the Bible, one revelation at a time. Now, let's explore the 5 races of giants in the Bible. In Genesis chapter 6, we are introduced to one of the Bible's most perplexing mysteries, the Nephilim. These beings were the result of a forbidden union between the sons of God and the daughters of men. They were giants, mighty, violent, and unnatural. So dangerous was their presence that God sent the flood to wipe them out. Yet the Bible contains a haunting phrase: the Nephilim were on the earth in those days, and also afterward. That one line changes everything. It means the giants returned, or perhaps they never truly vanished. How is that possible? 3 major theories attempt to explain it. The first claims some Nephilim may have survived the flood by hiding in places untouched by the waters. But this contradicts the Bible's clear statement that the floodwaters covered even the highest mountains. The second theory suggests a second rebellion, another group of fallen angels descending after the flood to repeat the sin of Genesis 6. The third, and perhaps most plausible theory, is that the Nephilim bloodline passed through the wives of Noah's sons. While Noah was perfect in his generations, Scripture is silent about his daughters-in-law. One of them may have unknowingly carried the corrupted bloodline into the ark. No matter which theory you believe, the result is the same. The giants returned. And not by accident. These weren't random monsters. They appeared in territories that bordered or even occupied the Promised Land. From Bashan to Hebron, from Moab to Ammon, the giants formed a living barrier between God's people and their destiny. Their presence was strategic, deliberate, almost as if some dark force had placed them there to oppose the will of God. These were not merely oversized warriors. They were ancient resistors, survivors of divine judgment, and symbols of a war that began in heaven but now played out on earth. And the story is only beginning, because these giants weren't all the same. The Bible reveals 5 distinct races, each with their own traits, territories, and terrifying reputations. In the next chapter, we'll begin our journey through this forgotten world, starting with the most mysterious and spectral of them all, the Rephaim. Among all the giant races that reappeared after the flood, none were more mysterious or more feared than the Rephaim. Their name alone sends chills down the spine. In ancient Hebrew, Rephaim not only refers to giants, but also to the dead or the shades, spirits of the departed. It's as if these beings were seen not just as giants in stature, but as entities straddling the line between life and death, ghosts in flesh, specters that walked among men. The Bible treats them not merely as a physical threat, but as remnants of something deeper, something unholy. These weren't just strong, they were cursed. They carried an ancient spiritual weight, and their presence in the land was a warning, not just a challenge. Their very name tied them to the realm of the underworld. In the ancient worldview, they were not simply tall enemies. They were the undead legacy of rebellion. Their most famous representative was Og, king of Bashan. Mentioned in Deuteronomy 3:11, Og is described as the last of the Rephaim, a colossal king whose bed was over 9 cubits long, that's more than 13 feet. And it wasn't a bed made of wood, it was made of iron, as if only metal could support such a monstrous frame. But Og wasn't just massive. He ruled over a kingdom in the region of Bashan, a place filled with fortified cities and towering stone structures. His capital, Ashtaroth Karnaim, is believed to have contained megalithic ruins, some of which still exist today. The Bible doesn't speak of him as a myth, but as a real historical figure, standing in direct opposition to Moses and the people of Israel. When Moses led his army east of the Jordan, Og stood between them and the Promised Land, and though he was considered the last of his kind, he represented a long and terrifying legacy. But Og was not alone in his day. The Rephaim had once flourished throughout the region, especially in eastern Canaan and Transjordan. Their presence is mentioned multiple times in Scripture, not just as individuals, but as a recognized race of warriors. Deuteronomy 2:20 even identifies several tribes as being counted as Rephaim, indicating their influence was widespread and feared. In ancient times, they were the benchmark. Other giants, such as the Anakim, were often compared to them. The Rephaim were the original template of post-flood giants. They were organized, politically powerful, and spiritually disturbing. They didn't just fight battles, they ruled kingdoms. Their strongholds were not primitive. They were advanced, fortified, and strategically placed, suggesting a high level of intelligence and societal structure. In a world struggling to recover after the flood, the Rephaim didn't just survive, they thrived. Yet for all their might, the Rephaim fell. Og, their last king, was slain by Moses and his army. His death marked the symbolic end of a race that had once defied God's purposes and terrorized the land. But more than that, it was a spiritual victory. The defeat of Og wasn't just a military conquest, it was a declaration. Even the most ancient and feared enemies cannot stand against a people led by God. The Rephaim had once seemed invincible, tied to death itself, ruling like immortal kings. But their fall reminds us that no force, no matter how ancient, how towering, or how terrifying, can stop the divine plan from unfolding. And as we will soon discover, they were only the beginning. Another race, fierce, bold, and bound to the stars, was waiting on the high hills of Hebron, the Anakim. If the Rephaim were shadows of the dead, then the Anakim were the very image of divine defiance. Their name echoes like thunder through the Scriptures, haunting the collective memory of Israel. In Numbers 13:33, when the 12 spies return from scouting the land of Canaan, they make a chilling report. "We saw the Nephilim there, the descendants of Anak, come from the Nephilim. We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them." That verse alone shatters any illusion that the age of giants had ended with the flood. The Anakim were not mythical, they were real, and their presence terrified even the most hardened Israelite warriors. These were not merely large men, they were direct descendants of the Nephilim, a continuation of the very beings God had judged once before, and somehow they stood again, taller, bolder, and seemingly undefeatable. The name Anak carries with it a sense of divine descent. Some scholars link the root of the name to the Sumerian word Anak, or Anunnaki, beings who, in Mesopotamian myth, were celestial entities who came down from the heavens. Whether myth or memory, the parallel is unnerving. The Anakim were not just giants in stature. They were seen as skyborn, connected to ancient power that defied the natural order. And they didn't just live in the wilderness. They built and controlled fortified cities, strategically placed on the high hills of Hebron, Debir, and Anaba. Their cities were so well defended that the spies described them as fortresses reaching to the heavens. These weren't nomads or wandering monsters. These were engineers, warlords, and gatekeepers of the high places, literally and symbolically guarding the gateway into the Promised Land. But their story doesn't end in intimidation. The Anakim were targeted for destruction. In Joshua 11:21-22, we're told, "At that time Joshua went and destroyed the Anakim from the hill country. No Anakim were left in Israelite territory. Only in Gaza, Gath, and Ashdod did any survive." Those three cities would become notorious. From Gath would come Goliath, the most famous giant in history. His defeat at the hands of David would echo through generations. But Goliath wasn't a one-off. He was a remnant of Anak, the last flicker of a bloodline once meant to dominate. The fact that they survived Joshua's campaign, even in part, suggests their tenacity and the spiritual persistence of the enemy's agenda. They weren't wiped out, they were scattered. A dangerous spark left in the ashes. What makes the Anakim especially significant is their placement. They were not randomly located. They held the highlands, the most strategic positions in Canaan. From these heights they could observe every movement of the Israelites. They could intercept, ambush, and block any advance. It's as if they were intentionally positioned to delay or deny God's people their inheritance. Some theologians see this as a physical manifestation of spiritual warfare, a dark force arranging the enemy to occupy God's promise. But while 10 of the spies saw only the giants, Joshua and Caleb saw God. And that contrast defines the entire struggle. Will you see the size of the enemy or the strength of the one who sent you? In the end, the Anakim fell, not because Israel was stronger, not because they had more weapons, but because they had a promise and they believed it. The battle against the Anakim was more than a conquest of land. It was a confrontation between faith and fear, between what was seen and what was promised. And as we move forward, we'll meet a race that was different still, one not only feared for their size, but for the raw terror they brought with them, the Emim. If the Anakim were terrifying by stature and bloodline, the Emim were terrifying by nature. Their very name means the terrors or the dreaded ones. According to Deuteronomy 2:10-11, they were as tall and numerous as the Anakim, and yet they carried an aura that seemed even more unsettling. The Moabites, descendants of Lot, gave them that name for a reason. They inspired a fear so primal that even memory of them haunted generations. These weren't just warriors, they were monsters. While other giants might intimidate with size, the Emim paralyzed with presence. Their grotesque appearance, their guttural roars. These traits are echoed in ancient Jewish sources, including Josephus, who claimed their battle cries could freeze entire armies in terror. You didn't just see the Emim, you felt them, and that feeling was fear. The Emim occupied the region east of the Dead Sea, an area that would later become the territory of the Moabites. They were not isolated beings, but a thriving population. Scripture refers to them in the plural as a people, a nation. They held land, controlled trade routes, and likely dominated neighboring tribes. But their reign was not eternal. Deuteronomy 2:9-11 reveals that the Lord allowed the Moabites to defeat and dispossess the Emim. As with the Rephaim and Anakim, their fall was part of a broader pattern. God systematically removed the spiritual threats surrounding his covenant people even before Israel entered the land. The Emim's defeat at the hands of Lot's descendants reminds us that God can use even imperfect people to accomplish his perfect will. But there's something more sinister beneath the surface. The Emim were likely related to the Rephaim. The Bible often mentions these tribes in parallel, suggesting a shared origin or at least a spiritual kinship. If so, then the Emim were not just giants. They were part of an ancient confederacy, a multi-headed resistance to God's plan. Their presence east of Canaan wasn't accidental. It was strategic. They formed part of the spiritual barricade that surrounded the Promised Land, an attempt to choke Israel before it could breathe. In facing the Emim, Israel wasn't just inheriting land. They were confronting fear itself, manifested in flesh, teeth, and war cries. And yet, as fearsome as they were, the Emim fell, not to greater armies, not to superior technology, but to God's design. Their destruction sends a clear message. No force of fear, no matter how monstrous, can stand against the purposes of God. Their legacy lives only in name. And now, we turn our gaze to another race, one forged not only by strength, but by the art of war itself, the Zuzim. The next race of giants, though lesser known, left a distinct mark on the pages of biblical history. The Zuzim, mentioned briefly in Genesis 14:5, were powerful enough to be listed among the nations defeated by a coalition of kings led by Chedorlaomer, king of Elam. The name Zuzim is derived from a root meaning strong or mighty, and ancient tradition suggests their strength was not limited to brute force. These giants were believed to be master warriors and weapon makers, experts in the metallurgy and technology of their time. Unlike the Emim, whose terror was primal, the Zuzim were calculated and disciplined. Giants of war, forged by battle and hardened by knowledge, they didn't roar like beasts, they marched like armies. They occupied the region of Ham, east of the Jordan River, an area rich in mineral resources, ideal for forging weapons. Some scholars believe the Zuzim were early metallurgists, crafting tools and weapons of massive scale. Their forges burned with dark flame, their swords were heavier, sharper, and more durable than any made by ordinary men. These weren't just giants in body, they were technological titans, advancing warfare in ways that made them nearly unstoppable. And yet, despite their innovation and might, they fell. The same passage in Genesis tells us they were defeated early, long before Israel's rise, in a war that reshaped the power structure of the ancient Near East. Their early extinction is significant. While other giant races persisted, the Zuzim were crushed in one swift campaign. Why? Because God was already clearing the path generations before his people arrived. The destruction of the Zuzim serves as a prophetic act, a message that no weapon formed against God's plan will prosper. They may have been stronger, smarter, and more advanced, but their strength wasn't enough. Chedorlaomer's coalition wasn't the true source of their downfall. Divine timing was. In Scripture, even those outside the covenant, like pagan kings, are often used as instruments of judgment when the time is right. The Zuzim's downfall also reminds us of a deeper spiritual truth. Not all enemies come with roars and claws. Some come with strategy and steel. The weapons of the Zuzim may have been forged by fire, but their defeat proves that even fire cannot withstand divine will. The Israelites would later face other giants, but this early battle was a sign God was already fighting for them before they even knew it. Now, as the smoke clears from the iron forges of Ham, we prepare to face the final race in this saga. Beings of intelligence, mystery, and possible occult knowledge, the Zamzummim. The final race in this ancient saga of giants is perhaps the most mysterious of them all, the Zamzummim. Mentioned in Deuteronomy 2:20 by Devor, these beings were described as a people great, numerous, and as tall as the Anakim. But unlike their brute force counterparts, the Zamzummim were not known merely for their strength. They were feared for their minds, their rituals, and their secrets. Their name is rooted in the Hebrew verb zamam, meaning to devise, to plot, and some scholars link it to ancient words connoting whispers, murmurs, or incantations. This has led many to believe the Zamzummim were practitioners of arcane knowledge, keepers of dark wisdom, perhaps engaging in celestial calculations, astrology, or forbidden rites that connected them to powers beyond this world. If the Rephaim were ghosts and the Zuzim were warriors, the Zamzummim were sorcerers cloaked in flesh. They dwelled in the region northeast of the Dead Sea, in what would later become the land of the Ammonites, descendants of Lot. Scripture tells us that the Ammonites defeated the Zamzummim and drove them out, a curious and ironic echo of the Moabites' defeat of the Emim. Again, God used the offspring of Lot, who came from an imperfect and controversial origin, to remove a spiritual threat from the land. But why were these beings so dangerous? Unlike the other giants who relied on muscle or mass, the Zamzummim seemed to manipulate knowledge and mystery. Their presence in mountainous regions, often associated with divine encounters in Scripture, suggests they may have mimicked the ways of God to access unholy power. Some archaeologists have discovered ancient structures in that region aligned with astronomical bodies, hinting at a lost science or spiritual technology now buried in time. What makes the Zamzummim especially terrifying is that they may have influenced other tribes subtly, not through war, but through ideology, control, and spiritual seduction. Perhaps they whispered into the ears of rulers. Perhaps they deciphered the stars, not to honor the Creator, but to harness creation. Before Israel could receive their inheritance, the dark guardians of Canaan had to be removed, those who guarded the land with knowledge, ritual, and spiritual manipulation. The Zamzummim represent a chilling reminder that not all giants are visible. Some hide behind books, rituals, and symbols. Their weapons are not swords or spears, but ideas, influence, and deception. And while they too were cast down, their legacy warns us, spiritual warfare is not always loud, it can whisper. With the 5 races now revealed, we must ask, why were they all positioned around the Promised Land? Why did each of them block the path to God's covenant? In the next chapter, we connect the dots and unveil the dark agenda behind it all. Step back and look at the map and you'll see it. The 5 races of giants didn't just exist near the Promised Land, they surrounded it. Rephaim in Bashan to the east, Emim and Zamzummim on the borders of Moab and Ammon, Anakim in the highlands of Judah, Zuzim near the forges of Ham. Together they formed a spiritual blockade, a fortress of fear around the inheritance God had promised to Abraham's descendants. This was no accident. These giants were placed, almost like dark guardians, to resist God's people before they ever crossed the Jordan. But here's the truth. God allowed it. He didn't clear the land before Israel arrived. He left enemies in place. Why? Because the inheritance of Canaan wasn't just about geography, it was about faith. The giants were tests, trials, challenges designed to reveal whether Israel would trust their God or tremble at shadows. And every time a giant fell, Og the Anakim Goliath, it wasn't just a military victory, it was a spiritual breakthrough. These 5 races weren't just remnants of corruption. They were instruments of intimidation, strategically used by the enemy to block God's purpose. But what was meant to stop God's people only strengthened them in the end. Giants fall, but only when faith stands tall. The giants may be gone from the earth, but they're still very real in our lives. We no longer face Rephaim in the hills or Anakim in the gates, but we do face giants in our hearts, in our families, and in our faith. Giants of fear, giants of addiction, giants of doubt, giants of failure and regret. Just like the Israelites standing at the edge of the promised land, many of us stop short not because the promise isn't real, but because the enemy looks too big. Remember what the 10 spies said, "We seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes." That's what fear does, it shrinks our courage. But Joshua and Caleb saw something different. They didn't deny the giants, they simply believed God was bigger. That kind of faith changes everything. The real battle isn't between you and your giant, it's between your fear and your faith. And whichever you feed will win. David faced Goliath with nothing but a sling and 5 smooth stones, but his true weapon wasn't in his hand, it was in his heart. He knew what too many forget. The battle belongs to the Lord. You don't need to be the strongest, you don't need perfect strategy. You just need to believe that God is faithful, even when the odds look impossible. Every giant that Israel defeated brought them one step closer to their promise. Every obstacle became an altar. And that's still true today. The very thing that was meant to destroy you may be the thing that delivers you. So face your giants, not with arrogance, but with faith. Because giants don't fall by power, they fall by promise. They said the giants were myths. They told us the stories were symbolic, poetic, exaggerated. But the truth was never lost. It was buried, hidden in plain sight across the pages of Scripture. 5 races of giants, 5 strongholds of resistance. A war that wasn't just physical but spiritual. This is the story they didn't teach you in Sunday school, not because it wasn't real, but because it was too real. But now that you know, what will you do with it? If this video opened your eyes to a truth you've never heard before, let us know in the comments. And if you're ready to go deeper, subscribe to Sacred Wisdom, because this is only the beginning. More truths await. Forgotten battles, hidden books, real faith. The giants fell, God's people prevailed, and that same victory is still possible for you.